What's on the line is what is the impact on the environment?
Yeah, so I'd love to talk about that part
Yeah.
of it.
So how much time do you spend thinking about the impact on the environment? How much of that is part of your research?
Well, so I'll try to make this quick, but I don't think in those terms.
Okay.
So like the environment implies it's like something separate from us, often above us. Like I don't think of the environment, the climate. I think of it as our environment,
Okay.
our climate. And so I think of like, and the reason this is important is I think of, for example, like if you like producing food, which is often considered economic, and like polluting a lake, I think of those as all our environment. And one of the focuses in Fossil Future is it's about, one of the chapters is titled Our Unnaturally Livable Fossil Fueled World. And that's about how the modern world is an amazing human environment. But part of my point is you look at everything in economics and environmental issues and you integrate them together. So how this applies to climate is I think of climate livability. What affects the livability of the climate, including our safety from climate? And so something like more frequent heat waves would have, all things being equal, an adverse effect. But the increased ability to use air conditioning would have a positive effect. And so fossil fuels are unique in that they have benefits that can neutralize and overwhelm their side effects. Like you take a polio vaccine, the early polio vaccines, it has benefits that outweigh its side effects, but the benefits can't stop the side effects. Like if you get, a rash or something like that, something bad, you still get it, but you get this benefit. But with fossil fuels, if you make it warmer, you can also make it even cooler in practice via air conditioning. Or if you cause more drought, you can have drought relief through irrigation, through drought relief convoy. So when I look at that's why I say, when you say, do you think about the environment? I think about its overall impact on our world. Every aspect I try to do equally. So the climate system, but also our ability to deal with the climate system. I think of those in an integrated way. So I think of both all the time.
But they're net calculations. So for example, you talk about increase in heat waves, but an increased ability to produce air conditioning units.
Right.
But an increase in heat waves would lead to potentially more deaths. The mitigation is the availability of air conditioning units.
But you could have less. But so what we actually have isn't, in the wealthier parts, we have fewer deaths because the air conditioning is more. So why do so few people die of heat in like Florida, Miami, where we are in Texas? Why do people move here? Because our ability to master the heat is so much greater than any change in the heat.
But you still have deaths attributed to that.
Well, but they're declining. So that there's always
nature
is always killing us in the first place.
You're missing my point. It's a net calculation, but it will impact the most vulnerable, those with the highest health risks or age or poverty. If there is a net change, there is still going to be some people who are affected by that who maybe can't get access to an air conditioning unit.
I wouldn't put those together though, because we could talk about the poverty aspect, but if you talk about older people, vulnerable people, if we are net safer from temperature danger, those people will benefit the most. It's their lives who are being saved in the statistics.
If we are net safer,
right.
There is a micro and a macro issue here.
Mm-hmm.
There, when you talk about your example there in Florida, great.
Mm-hmm.
But what about in central Pakistan?
Right, of course.
Bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
If we have an increase in heat waves, most likely that will be global. We'll have a global increase in heat waves, not just in Florida. And so, yes, in Florida, a rich country, a rich state, the mass availability of air conditioning users. You go to Bangladesh, Pakistan, poorer nations, they would have an increase in heat waves too. We might not have the same increase in air conditioning units. So maybe there's a global net change, but on a localized level, you might have like an increased risk in different countries.
Yeah, so we should talk about that. So I agree. So my main point is about the methodology is we need to look at the negatives and the positives, and I agree you need to look at them in different places. You can't just say, I'm in Florida, I don't care what happens in Pakistan. But we could talk about, so if we were to take like climate livability, like the general issues are dangerous temperatures, and that includes cold and warm. We have to look at cold because cold actually kills a lot more than warmth. We have to look at drought, wildfire, storms, floods, and then in sort of broadly sea level rises. Like those are the big
crop
categories. Yeah, so you could put that under heat and drought. So like in chapter 7 of the book, what I try to do is document at least first, let's understand what is the state of those what's happened in the last 100 years of climate impact and fossil fuel use. And so unequivocally, what's happened is we've become radically safer in all of those realms. So we're far safer from dangerous temperatures, far safer from drought, far safer from wildfires, far safer from storms, far safer from floods. I'm not saying everyone agrees with this, but if you look at the data is unequivocal. And so the overall statistic that I've popularized, and it's true from the International Disaster Database, is that climate-related disaster deaths, so quantifying these deaths, if you look 100 years ago when it was 1 degree Celsius cooler compared to now, but we've used a lot of energy to power a lot of machines to make the climate more livable. What we've seen is climate-related disaster deaths have gone down 98%, so a factor of 50.
What do you bucket in climate-related disaster deaths?
So, well, it's trying to capture, so the disaster database captures basically somebody, like there's a bad drought, there's a wildfire, like who's actually dying from these things. The one exception to this, which is an interesting issue, is heat and cold deaths are not all, most heat and cold related deaths are not bucketed in disaster deaths.
Okay.
So that you can have, and it's important because there's a whole literature of heat and cold having more mild impacts that people think of as deadly over time. And so it's different from just you had a heat wave and someone dropped dead, but it's like, okay, if you have generally too much heat in some area, how much of a contributing cause versus how much did cold suppress somebody's immune system? And what's interesting about those studies is they are universally saying cold-related deaths are currently a significant multiple, like 5 or more, of heat-related deaths. So those are the two data sets we have: climate-related disaster deaths, and then the heat versus cold.
What is causing the cold deaths? And where? So the significantly more cold deaths.
Yeah.
What is causing those deaths, and where are they happening?
You mean how does cold cause death?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is it in general? I mean, I'm not a doctor, but it suppresses your immune system. In most places, people die more in the winter than they do in the summer.
And where does that tend to happen? Do we know?
So this is an interesting thing, because you would think, oh, it's just happening in Scandinavia or something like that.
No, I wouldn't think that.
Oh, I said most people.
My assumption would be cold snaps in places again like Pakistan, which we saw the adverse weather there last year where there was a snowstorm, and perhaps they're not used to having central heating.
So I think it's a very astute kind of thing. But in general, what happens is even warmer places can get cold to the point where cold is more dangerous. So for example, in India, which you might think, oh, that's all heat, they have more cold-related deaths than heat-related deaths. So even in many warm places, just warming on its own would be net beneficial for a significant amount of time in terms of temperature-related deaths.
So why haven't we mastered heating in those places as we expect to master air conditioning?
Because there's not enough freedom and not enough energy.
I don't think that's a strong enough argument.
I think that's the only argument.
Well, I think India has enough energy.
Well, I said not enough freedom and not enough energy. So those are the two.
India's been pretty economically successful this last decade.
Well, they've gotten a lot safer. I mean, they're a lot better off. Their life expectancy has skyrocketed. So they're on an very amazing upward trajectory over the last 40 years. I mean, if I would suggest many more pro-freedom reforms. What do you think is...
But the point I'm trying to make is I don't think we can make the assumption if we have lots of heat waves, just because of economic flourishing, everybody's going to have access to air conditioning, as people who right now are dying from cold snaps don't have access to central heating. I don't think we can just make that assumption it will happen.
Well, but there's two things. So one is I'm saying that warming will generally be better for temperature-related deaths. So on its own, climate impacts can be positive as well as negative.
Uh-huh.
So it's important. We have to recognize warming has significant benefits. And one aspect of it that's important is we often call it global warming, but it tends to take place in colder parts of the world. So it's mostly cold places becoming less cold, which came up in my debate with Dessler, and he acknowledged this very much in passing, but this is a mainstream view. The UN says this. So it's mostly becoming, and so historically, it's not like the equator was just crazy, crazy hot, but it's that the poles had no ice. Like the world had no ice for most of its history. So it's more kind of polar warming or cold warming. So in general, when you're looking at the net of this, what you're going to see is you're going to have fewer temperature-related deaths, at least for a while. And as more and more people use fossil fuels, you're going to have more mastery over climate in both directions. So we will become safer from temperature-related deaths and much safer from the others. What are
the numbers? What's the gap between heat-related and cold-related deaths?
So as I said, these are like the disaster deaths are a little bit more exact because you're trying to count specific people where you can say the dominant cause of death was like this storm. The heat and cold related deaths are more kind of extrapolations. But as I said, they're like the range is something like 5 to 15 times cold versus heat. So you'll have some that say 5, some that say 15.
And as we solve that, that number would eventually flip.
Well, but I'm saying global warming on its own, quote, solves a lot of that over time. But I think the important thing is, so we're only talking about climate livability, and that's part of global livability, which is overall life.
I think the other thing you have to have in there is pollution-related deaths. I think if you're
for sure.
if you're talking about climate deaths relating to climate change from fossil fuels, you have to talk about pollution deaths.
Well, as another, if you're talking about fossil fuels, for sure you do.
Yeah,
it's not a climate issue. But
but we're talking about climate related to the burning of fossil fuels that puts carbon in the atmosphere.
Right. So as I was saying, you can think of it as it's really just the overall state of human flourishing, and you can think of that as like how livable is the world for different people. But so that includes environmental quality.
What I mean is, if we reduced cold-related deaths, but massively increased pollution-relaed deaths, that wouldn't be great. What's this, Danny?
How many die from air pollution each year? So
this would be a really interesting thing to talk about. I don't know if you want to talk about it in a minute, because there's a lot more to say about climate, but
let's talk about this.
But this is another. So my basic point is we have to look at the human flourishing as a whole, the livability of the world as a whole. And so climate impacts are part of that, but our ability to master those is part of it too. And pollution impacts are part of that, but our ability to master health is part of that as well. And also our ability to produce food and clothing, like all of these need to be integrated. And I'm saying that when you integrate them, it's unbelievably clear we need to be using more fossil fuels. That's my view. So we could talk about this in that context.
Yeah. So do we know what were the numbers of deaths related to heat and cold? Do we have actual estimated numbers? Can you find that, Danny?
I'll have a look.
Yeah. So you need to look at the different studies. I think one is Gasparini, but I never want to say a number that might be wrong. So I'll just withhold, but we can get that later.
So, but what a lot of yours comes down to is humans flourish with the use of fossil fuels, and most of the negative externalities we can solve with more fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, it's really the cost-effective energy, and that fossil fuels are and will remain uniquely good at providing that for billions of people. If we had nuclear now, I'd advocate using that.
So if it was a net balance calculation, we would want to understand the reduction in fossil fuel use, what number that would create.
Right, but what I'm saying is there's already this life catastrophe of most of the world being poor, and that's what I don't think is factored in sufficiently, which is because we know that the number one cause of death is poverty, which that includes a lot of these different things. Like when you're richer, you can lower air pollution, you can do a lot of stuff.
So this says 1.7 million deaths related to extreme heat or cold.
I don't know if this is
That's from
global.
University of Washington. Yeah, that's global.
And so 356,000 due to heat, 1.3 million with regard to cold, which is that's on the 5x kind of version of your point. That's about right.
But I mean, this is all trivial compared to poverty.
But compared to like 7 million from air pollution, according to this.
Right. So one plausible thing to say about fossil fuels, which I would actually agree with, is that
we should also say burning fossil fuels doesn't guarantee a reduction in poverty deaths. We have poverty in the UK. You have poverty here in the US. You have corruption across the world. You have failed states. Burning fossil fuels doesn't guarantee human flourishing in failed states or corrupt regimes. We can't just say in every scenario burning fossil fuels is the utopian solution, as I can't say that everyone holding Bitcoin is the utopian solution to money.
Yeah, well, if we talk about externalities, I can almost make the case that that's not true, because in a sense, like there's so many external positives from using energy, but I would think of it more as for everyone to have the opportunity to flourish, it's going to require a lot more energy, and that needs to come from fossil fuels.